Mr. Kane, you mentioned that several states has considered legislation or tire aging legislation. However, you mentioned that none of them were successful. Can you elaborate on why that was the case, or the limitations or constraints about that approach?
Sure. With respect to the state level recommendations, frankly, I think a number of them were certainly aimed towards improving consumers' awareness on tire age and looking to focus on the recommendations, which, keep in mind, we have recommendations from most of the major tire manufacturers now in the form of a technical service bulletin that says do not use tires after 10 years, regardless of tread depth. Or in some cases, they actually defer that to 6 years in the case of a couple of them. And we have the vehicle manufacturers saying 6 years, and there's a breakdown. So the state legislatures have looked at various ways to provide information to consumers, and some of those have centered on sale of new old tires. So in some cases, retailers, in fact, were selling tires that, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, in some cases well over even 10 years, although it's more rare today. And so these bills were aimed at addressing that. But frankly, I think there was a lot of onerous paperwork involved. It put a lot of burden in places, that would ultimately rest on the tire dealers. I think probably the best recommended practice, or certainly bill that we saw and supported, was the one that was proposed in Massachusetts, which was that in the state of Massachusetts, we're one of 16 states. That's my home state, and it's one of the 16 states that has a annual state inspection requirement. And in that state inspection requirement, there's 7 checkpoints for tires that must be followed. And our point of view is, well, hey, this is a good opportunity to insert recommended practice, simply because we have these recommended practices from the industry. This is not my recommended practices or NHTSA's. These are coming from the tire manufacturers and the vehicle manufacturers. And if we are looking at maximizing customer safety, can we insert that into it? And that bill was tabled, and I think you'll see a fairly steady trail of our work in that, and the RMA in opposition of that. And I think there's enough concerns raised by the RMA. In some cases, I believe they are misguided, because we keep focusing on this one point in time when tires fail. Well, I don't think we really need to look at it that way. I think we need to go back to this idea that there is a recommended practice, and we should be looking at that and providing that information, because the biggest breakdown is it's not finding its way into the service environment. And how can we do that? So state legislators have tried various attempts. They haven't been very successful. I think in part some of them have been onerous. The best we've seen was this possibility out of Massachusetts. And, I think that might be an avenue to look at. But at a minimum, looking for some way to provide information so that consumers have it, not just on page 287 of an owner's manual or in a bulletin that was issued or sitting on a website somewhere.
Thank you. Mr. Kane, can you also speak about strategies or guidance on how to deal with used tires?
Yeah, sure. The used tire issue is one that we've examined at close range and have done a variety of investigations into how the tires end up back into service. And ultimately, there's a whole machine there to make that work. And frankly, with all due respect to the RMA, they are doing some things that are important on that, but also their members are also enabling a lot of this to happen, because there's not enough of an effort to ensure that tires, when they're taken out of service, are in fact properly recycled. And when I say properly recycled, I mean destroyed. One of the things that became quite apparent and there is that the manufacturers can in fact affect the output of the tires that come out of a tire shop. And those tire shops, especially if they're company owned, those company owned stores, they're getting picked up by a major tire hauler, the state registered hauler. Those tires then are culled. They're examined. Anything that has legal tread depth or more gets taken and put into one line. We heard from the earlier panel today about how that works. In some cases, they're painted black to make them look good again, and they're resold. If there was a destruction policy, ensuring end of life, and this kind of goes back into kind of a big concept over what we can do around tires. What happens when we start treating tires from beginning of life to end of life, like we do with many consumer products, particularly look to the leadership in Europe on end of life issues. Start doing tracking, you start doing RFID, you start looking at how do you track that from end of life all the way through that process. Then you can start affecting change in significant ways. But there's a huge underbelly of a business that is cash-based and extraordinarily profitable when it comes to used tires. So when you start looking at how you can affect that, one of the ways you can affect it from a policy standpoint is insurance. We're already starting to see that. Insurance companies are, in many cases, unwilling to insure tire sellers that are selling used tires. They continue to do it because it's a cash business. So what happens when they get those tires hauled and they're paying $1, let's say on average, to get a tire hauled out of their shop, the hauler, if they get a percentage of, say, 10, 15%, which is not uncommon, to take those tires for recycle, they'll give a kickback to the managers. So there's a whole cash business going on behind the scenes in terms of how this all works. So there's a lot of money changing hands when the tire recycling company takes those tires and they bring them back to their scrapyard. Instead of turning a tire into chrome rubber or a pyrolysis plant or whatever they're going to do with it for recycling, if they can take that product and where they get paid $1 to get rid of it, and they're spending, let's just say, 75 cents on the dollar to do a proper disposal, they can turn that into a $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 sale. Profit margins have just gone through the roof. So you have this whole disincentive to get rid of any tire that's got tread on it. So destruction is important, and what we're seeing is tires will end up in service regardless. As long as they have tread, they will end up in service. So looking at it, the tire manufacturers, I think, have an opportunity to improve how that can play through, particularly at corporate-owned stores. Having a total destruction policy can go a long way, as well as looking at policies on the state level.
Thank you, Mr. Kane, for your perspective on this particular issue. I have a few more questions, but I want to give the opportunity to Member Weiner or others on the dais to provide any feedback or ask any questions.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating session, listening to 3 different points of view. The NTSB data, or the NTSB presentation, talks about the tire aging research and how you've been able to, in the lab, do artificial tire aging. Then we've got observations that following FMVSS 139, that there's reduced concerns about tire failures due to aging. Then we've got manufacturers' recommendations to remove tires somewhere between 6 and 10 years and pretty much all in between there. Then we've got RMA saying that NTSB data doesn't validate the need for expiration dates. So it seems to me we've got pretty much, whatever your point of view, there's something here to substantiate that point of view. How is this going to get resolved?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think, first, there may be some disparity amongst the folks here at the table and certainly amongst the advocates, NTSB, and the industry, but I think we can also look at the things that we do share, we agree on. And I think if you look at what's been done, whether it's by the ASTM, whether it's by the member companies of RMA, whether it's by NTSB, I think the agreement is that tire age degradation is occurring. Okay, it's happening. We know it's happening. We know the science behind it. We know the material science, the chemical science, the mechanical science behind what's going on. What we see is a variety of tires that are constructed, everything from a very low-speed rated traditional S-rated tire to a high-speed Z-rated tire and everything in between that. And we see a lot of gradients of those tires. And the construction of those products matters. So I understand very much why the RMA has taken the position that there is no one point in time. Totally agree with that. However, isn't it incumbent upon us to look at providing some baseline recommendations for a worst case scenario? And can we do that in a meaningful way? And I think that what we've seen from the industry is, we can come up with some places where it's pretty reasonable. Between 6 to 10 years, we've seen, again, from almost every vehicle manufacturer says, yeah, 6 years. Almost every tire manufacturer says 10. Okay? So, I'd say in a northern state, 10 is probably reasonable, but it may be different per tire. So where can you bring that to? Well, can you bring it down to the level of the tire itself? I mean, we have warranties for tires that are based on tread wear. How do we know that? They test them. How do we know how a tire ages? We test them. We know how that can happen. So if you take, a low-cost S-rated tire that may be $50 versus that high-speed, $350 tire with all of its, nylon overlays, with the, excellent construction, with the high degree of anti-ozone and antioxidant packages, you may not see a correlation. In fact, our analysis of the Phoenix tire data set that from NHTSA, the 2 tires we analyzed using the data showed that it was more important to know the age of tire if you wanted to get time to failure on one of the S-rated tires. But we could find no correlation between that and the high-speed V-rated tire at all. Okay, so there's this big wide gap. So what do? You come up with a recommendation that somehow meets us in the middle, that says, okay, here's a good practice. And if we look at, again, blood alcohol, I think is a good example. We all process alcohol differently. We function differently, yet we can agree that at some point, there's a point where we can find that middle ground. And, at a minimum, consumers need the information, know when their tire was made. They can't do it very easily now with a tin. I think automation of the tin gets us a long way. And machine readability, we're in 2014. I mean, it solves a lot of our problems, not just here at aging, but also the tire recall system. We start looking at this globally, automating the ability to take a tin and correlate that to these recommended practices makes us a lot safer.
But would you agree that there's probably a large portion of the population who don't understand that and in fact view tires as something that they have to do? It's like going to the dentist. You try to find the least expensive way to get around this?
If I may, Member Winter, I would also point out, though, that many of the instances we've seen, well, I don't disagree, inflation pressure is primary, okay, maintaining inflation pressure, but what happens when you get a 13, 14, 15, 20? In the last couple months, I've been made aware, I've investigated crashes up in the Northeast with 20-plus-year-old tires that have the appearance of a perfectly serviceable tire, and they were properly inflated and catastrophic tread belt separation leading to injury crashes. Now, those folks, what do you tell them? At some point, we've got to draw a line, and I think, I fully appreciate the inflation pressure issue and the maintenance issue. In fact, I cut my teeth in the tire business, and I worked my way through school in it and continued to do so while I was here in D.C., moonlighting at a tire shop just down the road. I know what it's like. I know what the worst of it is. At the end of the day, though, consumers need information. Tires degrade just like we do. And I can assure you that I can no longer do the things that I did when I was 20. My body will not handle that. We know that tires and the casings and the design of the tires, that's the case as well. At some point, we've got to provide information to deal with this and provide information to consumers and the service shops, because these are preventable crashes.
So this is all really an issue of consumer awareness, consumer education, proper maintenance, tire aging, the hazards of used tires. Gentlemen, do you questions?
And I think this is going to go as a follow-on to your statement, Member Wayner, is tomorrow we're going to be talking about consumer awareness. And I just want to know if you have any perspective of, is there any proof that consumer education works? In other words, is there any surveys that says that what population of Americans would actually know what the age of their tire is as far as the last 4? And that's for any of you can answer that question, that you can explain to me. Maybe Mr. Kane start.
There was a paper published in Human Factors, and I can provide you with a citation. I don't recall it off the top, but it was a survey of consumers to see whether or not they understood the DOT and if they had any recognition of the code as having a date in it, and I think the uniform answer was no. At a minimum, I think what we've seen from NHTSA has been very clear, age matters. The industry knows age matters. What the consumer doesn't know is that age matters because they can't tell the date on the tire. At a minimum, a non-coded date in manufacturer goes an awful long way. So if we really want to talk about education, then at least provide some meaningful way for consumers to understand what the heck they're looking at. Because taking a week and a year code and then also making it only available on one side of the tire and making a partial tint on the other, I mean, these are recipes for non-success, which we have seen. So I do think if there's room for education, and there always is, but it's certainly one of the things we should be looking at is non-coded data manufacturer if we're going to have recommendations.
My first question is for Mr. Kane. You mentioned periodic inspections of vehicles, and I was wondering whether we have any data to support that periodic inspection of vehicles actually leads to fewer tire failure accidents in that state.
You know, I don't know the answer to that, and I haven't looked at, I think you're aware there's 16 states that do a vehicle inspection, whether there is a reduction because of it. I really don't know the answer to it. However, I would say that at a minimum, if you're doing an annual inspection and you include tires in that, that's a mandated inspection, that's great, but I also think that most consumers at one point or another are going in for service in their vehicles, and hopefully they're getting to the service professionals that will also inspect their tires and look at those tires. But the problem that we've seen is at the inspection level, you know, it's all over the boards in terms of the capability of those folks doing the inspections.
Okay. Just one more question. I was wondering if, you know, there's several types of vehicles that you almost know that is not used as often, maybe RVs or like 15-passenger church vans or something like that. If you see a vehicle such as that drive into a service center, what's the conversation that a retailer should be having with that customer to determine what sort of tire they should get that would you know, to stay safe?
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, when it comes to RVs, I mean, if you look at the recommendations, the RV industry has been recommending replacement of tires between the ages of 5 and 7 years, and that goes back in excess of a decade. And it's pretty clear if you look at that, those recommendations by the RV industry folks were derived from the tire manufacturers themselves. And you'll see in their manuals and books and so forth that they've consulted with the various big manufacturers and asked them what the service life is of that product. And, you know, for an RV, in addition to the overloading issue that Ms. Norberg mentioned, which is a significant one, the fact that they sit for, you know, probably 90% of their life, it's essentially like an age spare. So it's that issue, it's the age spare, it's the used tire, it's the little used tire, and RVs fall in that category.
I'd like to thank the panelists for a really informative discussion. Member Weiner?
Okay, I believe we're out of air. I'd like to thank Dr. Gere Vega for facilitating this tech panel. Thank you to the presenters. This has been a very informative session. You've provided us a comprehensive review of the effects of aging and the standards past and present affecting tires still on the road today. And once again, you've helped us understand how much is and is not known at the consumer level. This concludes our first day of the forum. Thank you again for the panelists' participation. I appreciate all the panelists being pretty much on time. It's made my job much easier. I encourage everybody to join us tomorrow when we'll discuss advances in tire technology and explore tire maintenance and consumer awareness. Until then, we stand adjourned.